second panel for today is entitled Death Matters. Their focus is to discuss how death has been dealt with historically and across cultures. How is death being addressed in the 21st century, and how does it enter or not enter into public discourse? Conversations will center on the impact of the knowledge of mortality has on religion, philosophy, and law. Our moderator is Mr. John Dana, Associate Director of Campus Life, responsible for residence life, student conduct, and campus activities. Welcome, Mr. Dana.
Thanks, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here with us this morning. Welcome to the panel discussion on Death Matters. My name is John Dana. I'm the Associate Director of Campus Life at Concordia College, and we'll be moderating the discussion. As Amy said, following the panel discussion, we'll be fielding questions from the audience. You're welcome to use the microphone, but index cards are available for you to write your questions if you'd rather not speak. We also have an information sheet available for those who would like more information about related services and resources. I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with our expert panelist, Dr. Christina Staudt. Christina is the president of the Westchester End of Life Coalition, WELC, an organization she co-founded, and a presidential scholar here at Concordia College in New York. She's an advocate for looking at the dying experience as a holistic human event that involves family and community. WELC works to improve the end-of-life experience through educational programming and resources, offering preparedness, guidance, and information so Westchester families can live more confidently with serious illness and at the end of life. As a member of several advisory boards, Dr. Stout fosters education around issues of mortality and mourning. She's experienced in organizational and developmental work and writes about those topics related to death and dying. An active hospice volunteer, she sits by the bedside of those at the end of life and interacts closely with their families. Christina received a PhD in art history from Columbia University and is chair of the Columbia University Seminar on Death, which focuses on timely inquiries into dying. Thank you. Thanks so much. Dying, death, and grief, and organizing interdisciplinary conferences. Also joining us today are Marcus Pasquale. He's a student in Concordia's post-baccalaureate nursing program. We have Christopher Nepper, a theology student and a Concordia fellow. We have Dina Astorino, who represents our accelerated degree programs, is a behavioral science major who's doing a capstone project on grief. And we have Marcella Mulligan, who's a member of Concordia's nursing education adjunct faculty and has worked with Cavalry Hospital for more than 13 years. Let's begin with an overview on the subject from our expert panelist.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to the organizers for picking this topic, which clearly matters, and to all of you for being here. It's not an easy topic, and some people are afraid to address it, and I'm glad you're not. I don't know if you heard Woody Allen. He said, "I'm not afraid of dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens." And I'm glad that you're here when this panel happens, and I'm hoping that at the end of it, we might not have answers for you, but that you find some interesting insights and things that you might want to explore on your own or with other students and faculty on campus. So let's start with the sentence that I have put up there, a quote from Saul Bellow. "Death is the dark backing that a mirror needs if we are to see anything." Whether we are aware of it or not, death is entirely present in our lives all the time. Consciously or unconsciously, it is always hovering in the background. And we really should think about whether anything would be represented or even produced if there weren't for death. Think about it. If we weren't going to die at some point, would we do any of the things that we're doing today? Would any of the projects, undertaking we're doing take place? We might still enjoy dancing, procreating, dressing in beautiful clothes for the pleasure of it, but after a while, it would probably just feel like sheer indulgence. The reason that we as human beings are creating is probably deeply rooted in the fact that whether we think about it on a daily basis or not, we will be dying at some point, and there is an end to our life. So this is why the topic feels very important. It's also why it's a little bit scary. We die because we're born. That's the simple answer, why we die. All human beings and all things of life will die. And what we die into is clearly a matter of belief and cultural. And we have across the spectrum everything from the Egyptians, who really, in their cosmology, death was so central that life almost seemed like just a tiny forethought into what would really matter, which was death, the existence in life. And then we have Epicurus, who said, death is nothing to us. And he said that because he continued with, if we're alive, death is not here, death doesn't exist, we don't have to worry about it. And once we're dead, we have no awareness, so why worry about it then? So you have the whole spectrum, and we have so little time, there's no way that we can run through this entire spectrum of all the different choices that people have made. And I'm saying choices because these are cultural choices that have developed over time. A Buddhist family will be believing in reincarnation, as will Hindus, and death is necessary in order to improve yourself and move on to the next stage and eventually reach nirvana. So we all have these different choices. And how we express it also differs. I just want to show you two pictures that really brings this to the forefront, I think. This is the same event, crucifixions. They're painted at approximately at the same time. The one on the left is Matthias Grunewald, 1502, and the one on the right, approximately about 10 to 15 years later, by the Renaissance artist Raphael. And they're showing exactly the same event from about the same period by two Catholics, but so extraordinarily different in the way they understand this death. The one on the right is emphasizing the extraordinary pain that Christ went through when he died. And the one on the left is showing the perfection of Christ, and the way it is expressed in this painting is the beautiful rendering of Christ's body. He has absolutely perfect physique, it was the way that his perfection was presented in drawing. So same faith, different impressions. So we have entire spectrum, and as I said, with this little time, we can't go through a lot of it, so I'm going to focus on some of the thoughts in the more recent years in the West. And when I say the West, I mean Europe, North America, Australia, and other countries that we considered part of Western civilization. This chart gives you some idea. In the column on your left, I'm listing some of the things that people need in relation to death. And the first column is the traditional way of thinking. This would be, I would say, the way a lot of people in the Christian world address death up until began to get a little shaped on around the Enlightenment in the 18th century, but particularly at the late 19th century and early 20th century. This was the dominant view. If you found your truth in the theology, in God, in the Bible. If you needed to know the answers, you went to your clergy, and he in turn would turn to his understanding of God. When you were grieving, or if you were dying and you felt like you needed help, you turned to prayer, you turned to your congregation and your immediate family. And the primary concern was your soul. What happened to your soul after death? And your attitude towards death really was one of acceptance. It was a natural thing, and you could just accept it to happen. The modern is what I'm calling what ended up eating into this traditional view was science. And particularly towards the late 19th century and the earlier 20 and all of the 20th century, medicine and the advances that were made in medicine. So that became the truth foundation, not the only truth foundation, but it was brought up along with the theological answers. So the people you turned to find an answer when you were dying was not your clergy, was your physician. And when you were grieving, you might have turned to your clergy if you still had the traditional view, but you were just as likely to turn to psychologists and psychotherapists. In particular, the mid-20th century, the way to deal with death was what I'm calling here the stiff upper lip. You just did not really talk about it. You tried to get over it as fast as possible, and you did not share with anybody. It was a very quiet time for death. And the concern was very much with the body, in part because we were able to prolong death, dying through all the medical interventions. And also, if you think about the embalmment, that the first person who was famously embalmed in the United States was Lincoln in the 19th century, and then it became extremely popular in the United States to preserve the body. So the body became very central. And the attitude was, to a large part, to stay in hiding, as I said, and keep silence about it. People were put away, literally, almost, in a hospital, and there was not, visiting hours were limited, and you did not have a chance to have a family around you necessarily. And to this day, about 80% of people die in either the hospital or in some kind of medical setting. So then we moved into the postmodern, which is really what we're in now, the contemporary times, and the ideas for this started at the late 20th century. And it's the me generation, right? It's not what God thinks or what the doctor says, is how do I feel about this? What do I think? And it's turned to my choice, and I decide what my foundation would be. And I, as an individual, become the authority. And we want to start talking about this issue now. We want to express ourselves, and we want to share, but not necessarily in a religious sense. And what becomes particularly important is our personhood. We want to have control. I think an example that I can give here is the typical funeral in old days and today. In the medieval ages, the funeral was also a celebration to get away from the suffering and to join God in heaven. But it always remained in the Christian tradition a worship of God, until we started somewhere in the 20th century to not focus on God and what was happening in the transition, but we started to celebrate the life of. So the focus turned to the person rather than to the person's soul, but the personhood. So I think the centrality of the individual is really important and has really marked many of the issues that are the most important. I'm going to run through them here fairly quickly and then say a few words about each of them. Some of them will be addressed by the panel. So we're going to be speaking briefly about death and diversity, how we define death, the assisted dying, planning for the end, and the ecology, environmental issues, and grieving and growing. So these are issues that academia today and also public forums have put at the center. Death and diversity. This is obviously an enormously important topic, particularly today when the world is changing with globalization. I have done two charts here. All of the green in the USA chart are Christian. America is a very Christian country, and with a lot of people who still affiliate as Christians. There are about 70% of Americans who affiliate self-affiliate as Christians, in contrast to much of Europe, where it's less than 50%, and in some countries far less than that. As you can see, in the world, the Christians only represent about maybe one-third of the population, of the total population. Muslims in America are very small, just a little over 1%, and in the rest of the world, actually a whole third. And Buddhists and Hindu are very small in the United States. They and old-fashioned pagan religions are growing. And on your left here, you'll see that the nuns, the people who don't affiliate with any religion, they are, or with any belief, is 12%, and if you add to those the agnostics and the atheists that each represent a couple of percent, you come up to a growing group of about 16, and some recent surveys suggest that even 19% of the American population fall into this group, and these are people who have to be accommodated with thoughts and ideas around death. So very important that we don't leave all of those folks behind. I'm going to have to speed this up a little bit, but a very important question is, when is someone dead? Used to be an easy answer. You don't have a heartbeat and you're not breathing, you're dead. We got a problem. In the 1950s, we started CPR, we did life support. So suddenly here you have a body that's in effect dead, but it has a pulse and it's breathing through a machine. Now, is this a dead or alive? We might think it doesn't, it's not a crucial issue, but it becomes a very crucial issue for organ harvesting. A lot of people have been saved through organ harvesting, which you have to do on a recently deceased body. So you have to be able to call that boundary. So through a committee from Harvard that put together a study on this, there was a decision, an act passed in the United States called the Uniform Determination of Death Act, which said instead that it is irreversible cessation of brain function that should be the criterion for death. Really become very complicated in recent years because you can now keep people alive, not just for the few days that you were able to do when the act was passed, but for years. In a recent case, a young woman at age 13 was declared dead in California. Her parents refused to accept it, the brain death. And the doctor said, well, she's a corpse, we don't treat corpses. So their family took the corpse to New Jersey, one of 2 states that allow you to refuse brain death as a definition on religious grounds. And she lived for another 5 years. She was alive in New Jersey and dead in California. Really interesting and difficult issues to contend with. We didn't even realize that the body could continue to grow. She went through puberty even after the brain was dead. So this is something really worth thinking about. Somebody else here at the Marcy will be telling more about planning for the end of life, and I just want to very quickly bring up that we've got an incredible paradox here. Because of this focus on the person and the individual, we passed an act called the Patient Self-Determination Act, which means that each one of us has responsibility for our own health care, and we can tell doctors what we want, what choices we want to make. The problem is that we didn't really learn how to speak to the doctor, and the doctors did not learn how to speak to patients. So you still end up with this imbalance. The doctor has all the medical knowledge. The person has the knowledge about what his or her goals are and wishes, but nobody showed them how to communicate that. So I think we'll hear more about that from Marcy. Big topic. Whatever you call assisted dying, assisted dying physician, suicide, euthanasia, mercy killing. Don't know which term is closest to you right now. This is available in 9 states in the United States for somebody who is mentally competent with a 6-month terminal prognosis, assuming that the medication that's prescribed is taken by the patient, him or her self. I think it's worth thinking about, how do you feel about, do you feel that, who has the right to make these decisions? The medical assisted dying suggests the decision is entirely with the person. Physician assisted dying suggests the physician has some authority in the whole thing. Euthanasia suggests, and mercy killing suggests that outside person is actually killing. So I think this is an issue that each one of us needs to think about. what would we do, what would we want for ourselves, and what rights do we have or do not have in making these kinds of decisions for ourselves and for others by legislating on the issue. It's a very hot topic right now. It's not passed in the New York State legislature, even though it's been tried, and it also did not pass the a court case. So we'll see what happens in New York State. Two other topics I very quickly will mention, I think I still have 2 minutes, right? Is another very important, the physician-assisted dying is clearly a very value-laden topic. Another very value-laden topic is the environment and how much we care about that and think about that. And there are people who feel, I've lived an environmentally good life and tried to cut my carbon footprints while I'm here on Earth. Why should I pollute? Why should my body pollute the Earth after I die? And because a regular burial uses, thousands of tons of hardwood that could be coming down from the Amazon forest and other places. If we are embalmed, with 60% of all Americans who choose, whether they choose whole burial afterwards or cremation, but 60% of them are embalmed. This means that 800,000 ton of embalming fluid, mostly formaldehyde, gets seeped into the ground. So people are beginning to reconsider this. Green burial is a great alternative. The only problem with that is we don't have any space in the urban areas. Recomposing is something that's new. It's only been passed in the state of Oregon, and it means you're placing mostly all of the bodies in effectively a mass grave. Could be objections to that by a lot of people, but they are, and then with microbes added and oxygen for faster recomposing, becomes soil, dust to dust, really returning to the earth. Cremation, you might or might not have heard about, uses a third of the energy. It freeze dries the body, and then so it's like freeze-dried coffee pieces, and then that's entirely organic, and you can put it in the ground and plant a tree. Alkaline hydrolysis uses very little energy, about 12% of cremation. Cremation is very polluting, it's also known as aquamation. You add lye to the body, and it puts it in under high pressure, and it decomposes very quickly. It's been used for cattle for well over 100 years. There's a mushroom suit that you can purchase, which has mushrooms eating up the toxins in your body, leaving a clean material. And the picture that you see there is a thought from the Columbia University's Death Lab. Completely carbon neutral, the body is placed into these vessels, and when the body decomposes, it actually releases energy, and they have worked out a patented method to capture that light, so that this is a rendering of how you could have the effectively burial ground, except you have lights lit up all under the 59th Street Bridge. So it also solves many of the space problems. Big topic and something to think about. Finally, because my time is up, two things we're going to hear from Diana and Marcus, and just want to mention that most people are more resilient than they think, and taking positive action and finding meaning really can help us grow, and so that death is not always something that is negative. Leaving you with this, we have 100% mortality. It comes as a shock to a lot of people, but that is the truth. So carpe diem, seize the day, and let's make the most of life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that insight. We really appreciate it. I want to start off by talking with the panel about grief and how we process our own mortality, as well as the death or terminal diagnosis of a loved one. When many of us think of grief, the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief comes to mind. How subjective or formulaic is the grieving process, and how is our understanding of grief evolving in the 21st century? Marcus, I understand you have endured some tragedy in your life, and are you comfortable sharing your experience with us today?
Yeah, for sure. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Marcus Pasquale. I'm a student in the post-bacc nursing program here at Concordia. So for just a little history, my parents were just recently retired, probably about a couple months before I started the program here. And of course, because they were the types of people my parents were, the first thing they did after they retired was go on a medical mission overseas. Unfortunately, there was an accident, and I lost both parents at the same time, suddenly. Again, about a couple months before starting this challenging program. Thanks, professors. So, as far as grief is concerned, I suppose my reaction is probably colored also by my culture. When the day we found out, I allowed myself probably about a day to be devastated. Just the sudden loss of both at the same time. I was non-functional for a day. But as I said, culturally, since I am, in my family, I'm the firstborn Asian male, I have to take care of everything. I had to get my parents back from overseas. I had to work with the US Embassy, the Philippine Embassy, boats, planes, everything, just to try to get them home right away. There wasn't time for me to actually feel or go through a lot of the traditional grieving process. I know we're probably gonna touch on some of the specifics about it later, but there was a ton of compartmentalization that occurs. There is, you're allowed to feel grief in your head, but during the day when there's stuff to be done, you've got to, I had to put it in a box, put it in the back of my mind, and get moving with, first, getting my parents back home, second, setting up the arrangements for their final rest back here in the U.S. Because as part of the preparation for that, my parents would often, and as their son, I'd always, when these conversations came up, I would be like, yeah, no, I know, everything will be fine, you guys will be fine, but they let me know they wanted to be laid to rest back in the United States, and they had some kind of specific things about it that they wanted to be done. The rest of my family were allowed to grieve. I had to take care of business. But in a way that ended up, as you had mentioned previously, you end up being a lot more resilient than you think. The preparations for me ended up being, I suppose, my way to grieve. I was able to set things up the way, my parents wished. I was able to get, plots where, that they wanted, and be able to try to organize, the family, the transportation of their bodies, and all the arrangements to get it done so the rest of my family didn't have to worry about anything. So I suppose, like I said, to reiterate, that was, I guess, my way to grieve that I'm sure we'll touch on later on. So I suppose I'm here as the case study. And, my colleagues over here will probably introduce you to a lot more learned experiences, and we'll turn it over to them.
Yes, Dina, I understand you're working on a capstone project involving grief. Would you care to
Yes.
share any information about your findings or research?
So, my research has shown so far that grief really is different for everybody. Like Marcus put himself into planning the funeral, getting his parents home, and he's probably, I would guess, grieves every day. And I think that's what I'm learning during my research, is that grief, to make it this process that has a beginning and an end, is kind of unfair. And I know, we study human development and the stages of life, and sometimes grief wants to be put into these stages, which is fine to understand maybe what you're feeling during that time, but I think it's unfair to say it has a beginning and an end. Because anytime you lose somebody, the feelings of grief and loss reemerge different times, you know, during their anniversary of their death and during certain moments that you may have shared with them. So I think to call it a process desensitizes it for a lot of people. And it's important, I think, Chris, you spoke earlier about saying the wrong thing and the right thing to somebody when they're grieving. Just being there with someone and helping them remember the person. I think that's something that I've studied that is very helpful for people. And we talk about resilience, and yeah, we are resilient, and a lot of the, in college though, in college students, they have been, you guys have been kind of ignored a little bit because of your age, and well, you guys can get through it and stuff like that. So that's some other things that I have, in my research, found out that it's important to pay attention to the people around you and to help them to get through the time and just to be there with them. And like I said, limiting it to those stages of grief is really unfair because it is something that goes on throughout your life and it reemerges.
100% true.
One of the things in recent research is that we've really put away the idea of closure. This was something that Freud brought up in one of his first studies, really not founded on any real research. He just decided that you should just put the object of your grief away. In spite of the fact that when his own daughter died, he realized that this was not possible. But for some reason, through the 20th century, psychiatrists and psychologists hung on to this idea that we had to figure out a way to find an end to this. Dina is absolutely correct. You know, it's not a process. And today we're talking about something that the psych profession calls continuing bonds, and encouraging us to continue to stay connected with those people who are deceased and were important in our lives. And it's not just a matter of going back and looking at the memories you had with them. If any of you have a close person in your life that has died, you might actually continue the conversation with them and say, I wonder what my mother would have done in this situation. Or you see a situation and say, I would have loved to show this to my grandmother. I know she would have loved it. So the conversation actually goes on, and you are growing. The representation of that person in your mind is actually growing, and it's helped a lot of people who previously felt that they had to put a lid on things. And putting the lid on things was a really 20th century thing when we were hiding death, and it was just a convenient way not to have to deal with it. So I really endorse what Dina is saying.
Okay. So we can move on to the next topic. Concordia is a Christian community of higher education, but a vastly diverse one. Throughout the world, culture, religion, and community are ingrained in death and end-of-life experiences. Ethics and values surrounding physician-assisted dying, what some call assisted suicide, burial rituals, environmental disposition, what happens to our physical form after we die, and other sacred customs are polarizing subjects. How do religious faith and cultural traditions fit with societal shifts in death and end-of-life practices? Chris, as a theology major training for future church work, can you speak to the complexity of faith in the face of tragedy and loss?
Yeah, absolutely. Ooh, wow. Oh my gosh. You guys are awake now. Wake up for me. I would love to take a couple minutes to talk about this. I'm going to take about 5 minutes to kind of maybe give you some framework about what Christians believe and why we believe it, and why I think it's probably one of the best approaches to death that there is, that the world has today. So if you want to know what any kind of worldview, religion, culture, values about life, you have to look at how they treat their dead. And I can't speak on all religions, but like I said, I'm going to try to give a brief framework about what Christians believe. And Christianity at its core is a religion that focuses on valuing life. And that is regardless of any differentiating factor. And therefore, when we talk about death, we don't focus on the end, but we focus on a new beginning. And that's seen in Christian funeral rites and burial rites, that it's not like Greek culture where we're sending the person off, sending them across, that we need to do something. It's about we're recognizing that Jesus, the angels have come down, and they've taken that person. And at the end of the day, Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And so remember that, because I'm going to come back to it in a second. So like I said before, as what you do to your dead really shows you what you value in life, and that's why Christians typically are going to bury their dead. So the first reason is Jesus was buried, so if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me, probably. And we also believe in the resurrection of the physical body. So on the last day, I'm going to come back physically and be raised. Sorry to all you green people, I think you're a little more important than freeze-dried coffee pellets. So yeah. So to go off on a slight tangent there, if you look at the trend of Christianity in the last about 150 to 200 years, there's this systematic progression of turning Christianity and the Bible into some kind of moral code and a way of life, and we do a lot of soul talk, as I like to say it, and I don't hear a lot of Christians actually discussing death and the physical body too much, which is interesting because we clearly proclaim that God comes to us through Jesus in a physical body. So if you're starting to catch it, Christians are kind of focused on the body a little bit, and it's important. And frankly, it's very concerning because we talk about, when Christians talk about hope, our beacon of hope is a naked man suffering and dying on the cross. And even more absurd than that is that naked dying man is actually God, that's what we confess. And so it's kind of easy to see how Christians how early Christians in the first century are kind of seen as insane. If you remember the paintings, you see a dying man, and that's our beacon of hope. Yeah, maybe they're up there. I don't know. Maybe they'll come back. Anyway, if you would just want to look at I feel like it's a good background for this talk. So if I can actually take a couple minutes to provide some rationale why I think we're moving away from talking about death in the body in Christianity, I'd like to do that. And so I want to put yourself in the time and era of Jesus, or even really about 150 years ago, and death would have been a lot more visible and visceral experience. We're moving towards, for better or for worse, kind of a legalization and a numbing of death because it's all done behind closed doors. But if you lived about 150 years ago, most of the people sitting in this room probably would have had a sibling die in infancy, probably would have had your parents die. You definitely would not have had grandparents and great-grandparents, and you would have been a witness to all of that. You would have seen it all. It wouldn't have been done behind closed doors like it is now. But I think there's some problems to that. I think that because it's become so systematic, we're removing a lot of humanity from it. And I don't care really what century you live in, or how well you dispose of the body or handle the dead body, losing a parent or a sibling or anybody who's close to you is still extremely, extremely difficult thing to navigate. And so I think that's where Christianity still provides a clear framework for how we should deal with that. And like I said, we value the body in a way, we value death in a way, not value death, but we see death in a way that you don't really see in other world religions. And so there's really three main areas that Christians handle grief after death and the hope that we have, even though it's kind of still a very difficult situation to navigate. And I had a conversation when we were preparing for this, came up that Marcus's parents were good Catholics, so I feel like I can use this as an example. So there's really three areas that we can put our hope in as Christians that you don't find from other worldviews. The first thing, when Marcus tragically lost his parents, because he is a Christian and they were Christian as they came up, he can confess that it wasn't just lights out. His parents are in the embrace of Jesus, and that provides a little bit more hope and a little bit more comfort than somebody saying it's just over. At least for me. Second thing is in our practice of the Lord's Supper, communion, the Eucharist, whatever you call it, the majority of Christians would confess that what is happening there is the physical presence of Jesus, all right? So what Marcus then can say is, yeah, my parents have died, they are with Jesus. If I go see Jesus at the altar, I'm also seeing my parents. And that's a great coping mechanism, I think, to really put in tangible ways that although death has occurred, it does not separate us. The third thing is, and the one that I really take the most comfort in, and the thing that I don't think we actually hear too many people talk about, is the resurrection, the physical body. So we die, we're with Jesus. We don't really know what that looks like. Our soul is there, our spirit, whatever that may be. But what I do know is the tangibility that there is in the resurrection of the body. So in the last day, Jesus comes back, as the Christians confess, and Marcus will be able to hug his parents with a physical body, and it's not just a soul, it's not just out there, it's physical and tangible. And I think at the end of the day, if you're going to put your faith in something, that is something to put your faith in, that we all will one day be able to be physical again with one another and in communion. And don't get me wrong, Christianity doesn't make death easier. Death is a very hard topic to deal with, no matter what worldview that you talk about. But it does provide some, even if it's in the dimmest kind of light or hope, it does provide some kind of hope. And I think to talk about the theme of this panel, which is should we talk about death, I say for a Christian, absolutely, you should talk about death, because to talk about death is also to talk about life. So yeah, Christians definitely should be talking about death. And so I hope that would maybe open up some dialogue later. I purposely am going to leave some holes there, but I do want to engage with you guys a little bit later. Thank you.
There'll be a lot to engage with, I'm sure.
I hope.
Would anyone else like to chime in on that sort of the theological and scientific facets?
Just a quick comment. I just think it's very interesting that 70% of Americans consider themselves affiliated with Christianity, and we could add to those, the Muslims that also consider themselves, believers in a heaven, according to dogma. But actually, a lot of the unaffiliated people also have decided they're going to believe in heaven. But most interesting, only 60% of Americans believe in hell. Americans are really smart, they're kind of focusing on the thing that might be good and forgetting that. But I have a question to you regarding cremation, which obviously is a topic that Vatican II permitted for Catholics in the mid-1960s, and it was first very reluctantly received, and today about 50% of Christians, more than 50% of Christians actually, choose cremation, and I thought that was now an acceptable way for Christianity, as long as the intention was not to scatter the ashes, which is not permitted. So you can cremate, but you can't do cremation.
Well, I would say, like I said, how you treat your body in death, how you treat the body in death, is a profession of the faith that you hold in life. So I think if you treat your body, there's all kinds of situations in death where you don't have a body. If you're a tragic plane crash, your person dies, they're completely consumed in fire. How can you say that God can't work with that to bring that body back? I certainly would say that God can bring that body back in physical form. His ways are much greater than my ways. I can't understand all his workings. But I think there is something to recognizing that your body has value, that your body has value. And I think, you brought up Vatican II. I think at the end of the day, yes, you have to recognize that the authority the church has been given by God, but you also have to recognize that it is people making these decisions. And when you operate under that kind of mindset, it leaves room for interpretation.
It definitely leaves you in the postmodern era in a way, because it is our personal choice that you are advocating, which is very 21st century.
Okay. So we're going to move on to our last topic before we field questions from the audience. Many Americans have a head-in-the-sand avoidance of our mortality. According to different recent surveys, 57% of U.S. adults do not have a will or living trusted, and about 65% do not have any advanced medical directives, such as a living will or healthcare proxy. In 2015, the Associated Press and NORC Center for Public Affairs Research found that more than half of Americans aged 40 or older report little to no long-term care planning. The sandwich generation, ages 40 to 60, find themselves supporting both their own children and their aging parents. With death and terminal or long-term illness come complicated legal matters, questions about health insurance and coverage, end-of-life decisions, and financial strain, all in the face of tremendous grief and loss. What can we in this room do to better plan for the death or long-term care of a loved one? Marcy, can we hear from you first on this?
Absolutely. I don't know if this is on. Can you hear me, yeah? Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you. Just listening to everybody else speak as well made me think about some of the things that might help us to have the conversation that none of us really wants to have. And I thought about the fact that I've witnessed death and burials both here and in Ireland. In Ireland many years ago, when there were no funeral homes and we just did everything in the house. And that's a very different experience that involves the whole family. Because it's right there in the house. You take the person who has died and you wash them and you bathe them and you actually place them on the floor for a minute till you put on new sheets, and then you put the body back up and you have the wake in the house. It is a very much of a family affair that every family gets, all people really get involved with. And I think in its own way, that ritual and that involvement of family from an early age, say, allows us maybe to feel a little bit more comfortable with the fact that death actually happens, because it's not secluded in a funeral home. Years ago, children weren't allowed in hospitals. So if somebody died, they died alone, not alone, but certainly the children get that opportunity to see their parent or their loved one or their grandparent or whoever it was that was in the hospital. So death was sort of just put over here and through the years here in America. And I think that the loss of rituals, the secularization of the dying process and putting it into having other people take care of it, having death happen in a hospital, having death now when you're dead go to a funeral home, all of those things probably have maybe impacted our discomfort with actually talking about end-of-life care. It's not a comfortable topic for anybody, and it's something that is so important because I worked in Calvary for 15 years, and watching people that really had no preparation, that maybe didn't even realize that that's why they were going to Calvary, that it was an end-of-life facility. I actually saw patients that were told in another facility just to go to Calvary and boost themselves up a little bit and then come back for curative care, which wasn't ever going to happen. It was like the elephant in the room. And people weren't prepared for the conversations before even getting to end-of-life care, and they certainly weren't ready at the end. And to some extent, if that's the way they came into Calvary and they were going to be there for an average of 21 days, you would actually sometimes see the Kubler-Ross aspect of anger and not being happy and depression, all those stages, even though it's not a linear progression. I don't start off here and end up here. I don't have a beginning, I don't have an end. But the end-of-life period, which might have been a time for really lovely conversations and family time, was greatly impacted by not having had a conversation. And so now we were really in the throes of some of those aspects of the Kubler-Ross grieving process. You know, had these conversations happened earlier, sometimes grief is mitigated by anticipatory grief. If you know somebody is maybe going to die and you start seeing that they're not doing well, if the physician says that, you know, we're managing this right now, we're sort of in a managing part of your diagnosis as opposed to the curative stage. I think that without even realizing it, we start to anticipate the progression of that disease process and where it might end. So I think there's several things. I think that medical schools and nursing schools and people that are involved in healthcare need to feel more comfort with death. That's something I didn't always have. When I was a very young nurse a long time ago, I remember if a patient died, we all looked at to say, who made a mistake? Who did something wrong? And And imagine, I mean, but that's really how a lot of us felt. Everybody felt that they could cure everything and do everything and maintain people and figure out something to keep them going. So there's always been sort of a discomfort even on the medical part of dealing with death. So I think that there's a group down in Washington, this Dr. Pekowski, she has this Jewish Foundation, and she does an awful lot of education for physicians and nurses. I've actually been down there. I've been away on retreats with her. And it helps us as care providers to feel more comfort. We also need insurance companies to support that conversation. A conversation about my end-of-life care goals is not something you can time to 15 minutes and say, done. And that's all the time we have, because we're in a managed care type of healthcare system here. So I think it's a comprehensive effort, and I think also that we as people have our own responsibilities to educate ourselves, to prepare ourselves. I just printed out this thing here. It's from the Conversation Project. It's a way to sit at home and start thinking about, you know, what would I like? What would I like to do if and when the time comes? There's another one called 5 Wishes. And actually, Marcus and I were speaking before about a really important aspect of it that I didn't think about, was the fact that before his parents would ever go away, they used to have a conversation with him. And I'll let Marcus tell you what that was.
And I didn't really think about it in these terms until you and Chris started talking this morning. But I like to think those conversations were probably initiated because of my mother. As I mentioned, my mother was a nurse, and I suppose she was not averse to the conversation of that topic and what Chris was talking about with their faith. They were very devoutly religious, and I know in their minds they didn't think of death as the end, but more of a type of continuation, where they didn't really have any apprehension about talking about the topic with me. So I was probably about most of your guys' age, in my 20s, when they started telling me, if something happens to us, this is where everything is. So in terms of preparation, I felt, not emotionally prepared, but I was everything else overhead prepared. They left, I knew where their book was, I knew their bank accounts, I knew their passwords, I knew their estate lawyer, I knew their investment guy, I had everything kind of road mapped out for me. So in terms of preparation itself, I'd like to encourage, if you haven't had a conversation yet, maybe it's something to bring up, because while you're taking care of a lot of that overhead, while that stuff is happening, you probably won't be in the greatest frame of mind, even if you do have some anticipatory feelings going into it. It's a very important aspect of the whole process, and like what everyone's been saying is maybe trying to find a way to destigmatize the conversations is something we have to try to push forward.
I think we don't always remember about the financials and how important that is. Financials are a big aspect of death and dying, and for your parents to have had a whole list of their passports, their bank accounts, what to do, where to go, I think that just eased the transition. At least that part you didn't have to worry about, to be able to get into the Chase Manhattan Bank and see what you had to do there, because there are costs associated with dying as well. And to be able to access that which you needed, I really applaud your parents. So here we may think on this conversation project, this might be more about what are my wishes. Do I want DNR? Do I not want DNR? Do I want to be intubated? What those type of medical decisions. But there's also these financial decisions as people with families who we want to make sure that we ease the transition in any little way that we possibly can. So I just thought that was a wonderful thing that your parents did, to just ease that for you, because you had so much already on your shoulders to cope with. And just one last thing with financials, and I don't even know if this fits in here right now, but it's something that is close to my heart. When somebody is in hospice and palliative care and maybe they want to go home, it's a really difficult thing to do, because to take care of somebody 24 hours a day is a big emotional, physical, and financial burden. So that's why I think a lot more people wind up dying in hospitals, because we don't have enough family members and support and possibly enough financial resources to afford to do what's done in a hospital at home. So whereas so many Americans would like to die at home, it's not always feasible for them in the current system we have. So maybe we could all get a little involved in advocating for more resources for that which we all say we want to do.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I would, add that all of you should go home and talk to your parents and partners and spouses if you have to and this is a really good time to have the conversation. So much better than in the emergency room, where nobody is particularly capable of making decisions. That to do it really quick and dirty, basically everyone over 18 should have a healthcare proxy, which means that somebody else can speak for you if you're unable to speak for yourself to make medical decisions. Should be somebody who knows you and whom you trust. You should appoint that. If you have any kind of assets, you should also have a will, and you should have something called a durable power of attorney. That means that if you are unconscious and unable to speak for yourself, or your parent is, you as the person who has the durable power of attorney, you are able to make financial decisions. So you are able to access their bank accounts or wherever you might need to pay bills, etc. And the fourth thing that a lot of people, you mentioned that, Marcy, which was great, passwords. A lot of people, many of you probably have social media of various kinds. Think about how you would like that to handle if you were suddenly in an accident. And how much of that would you like to have out there? Who should be able to access it? We're talking about a digital executor today. Appoint somebody who can go in there and either close your accounts or set up a new one if you want a memorial account. But it's important that somebody knows how to access your social media as well. I also know, we might talk a little bit about, many people say, well, how am I going to start this conversation with my parents? It's too difficult. So I have a few suggestions. One is going back and say, I just sat on this panel and they told me I had to do this. Or you might say that you had read or heard about a situation where somebody was in a hospital and they had become unconscious, and it was a question of whether an intervention that would bring them back to 60% of capacity was going to be taken or not, and what would your family member have wanted in a situation like that? Many of you are too young to remember Terry Schiavo, but there was a great controversy between her parents and her husband about whether she should remain in effectively a vegetative state, and would she have wanted that? So these are the kind of choices that you might bring up and mention them. And then you might just say, Mom, please do me a favor. This is not for you. This is for me. I need to have this conversation. I need to do these. And most parents are pretty good about wanting to give their kids a favor. So those are some suggestions of how you might approach that conversation.
Yeah, I just want to add that we do have a resource sheet. We printed a few copies here. So there's a lot of links and websites and information for long-term healthcare planning, information about various nonprofit organizations and other things to support a whole range of areas and expertise involving end-of-life care and death and grief and and all of that. So there is some information here. If we run out of material, you're welcome to email me, john.dana@concordia-ny.edu, and I'd be happy to provide that document for you as well electronically. I think we're able to open up questions from the audience at this time. If anyone has any questions, happy to. Yes.
So, I mean, this question could go for anybody on the panel, but like when it comes to like after death from like my body, like religion shows that like your body is just a vessel, but like your mind and soul. So like I don't see personally, like I feel like if like I tell anybody that asks me like if I die or something like that, like what does it matter what happens to my body? Because if you take faith out of it and religion, one, the price, the financials of it. Two, like, you know, it's a joke, but they say you go to Queens to die or pray. Because like if you look around, there's a bunch of churches, but like when it comes to like as like a society, I don't want to sound like so emotionless or not, because it's really like not like that. But for the sake of asking a question, like, do you feel like it's really that important after death to keep that like the body around or whatnot, or have a funeral or anything like that, or can it just be like if whatever the loved ones of that family needs to kind of like cope with the death, but after that, like, what do you do?
Do you want me to take that? I can, I'll take that one. There's a lot going on there. Yes, to one of your questions, I think what you do with the body does matter. I think for two reasons. From a Christian perspective, it allows the Christian to say what we believe is different about versus every other world religion. What we believe is different. We believe that your body has value. Now, does that mean what you do to the body has any kind of effect on God's ability to resurrect it? Absolutely not, I would say, absolutely not. But it does provide an outward witness of the Christian faith to say, yes, we are different. We believe in the resurrection of the body, and that's what makes us different. And I think, you know, from my time working in churches and dealing with funerals and post-death matters, I think there's a lot to do with the rites and the rituals that we have that assists in the grief process. So you have really three kind of periods that you go through, three kind of rites that you go through when somebody dies in the Christian faith. You know, you have your commendation of the dying, which happens at the time of death, and all of that has language of the remembrance of your baptism and the resurrection of the body. Same thing with your funeral, memorial, given if there's a body or ashes or no body. Same thing, remembrance of your baptism and the resurrection of the body. Same thing, and your third is the committal, where you're actually putting the body into the ground or the urn into the, whatever you put the urn into, the name escapes me. But same kind of language, resurrection, remembrance of your baptism and the resurrection of the body. So I think the rites and the rituals do help with the grieving process from what I've seen. And as far as how you handle the body, I think for the Christian, it does provide a powerful witness of what we believe and why we're different.
So I'm not going to argue against that, because that is for those who are believing Christians, but as we know, that is only about a third of the world's population. And I certainly think it's very important that we also are tolerant to those whose beliefs say, Buddhists and Hindus, that you should be burnt on a pyre, and the vessel, which is totally unimportant, will disappear so that the spirit can continue and be reincarnated in a different body. I also very much respect people who want to, as a final gift to the world that they're leaving behind, perhaps they're uncertain about any world they're going to, but regardless, I know many Christians who have chosen to donate their body to medical research. I know this is totally abhorrent to certain evangelists, certain Orthodox Jews, and some of the more conservative Muslims, and but it's also, you know, a choice. I think we're really living in a world in the 21st century where we have such tremendous diversity that the choice is difficult, but I think it's important above all to be very comfortable respecting other people's choices in this regard and not denigrate it. On rituals, I really, want to make the point that Chris is making. Rituals are important, and this is perhaps an area where the humanists are people who are usually agnostics or atheists, and they are beginning now to create rituals. But rituals that don't have the depth of 2,000 years somehow don't feel like they have the same heft, perhaps. So that is one, area where perhaps over time rituals will develop that are comfortable, that talk about a transition, even if it's not a transition into a next life, but transition into returning to an earth. And there's a certain amount of holiness and spirituality that can be present even for people who are not devout Muslim, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, or Hindu. Just a little counter to your...
Yeah, and I would agree with you on the point. I think she absolutely kind of hit on what I was trying to say. The Christian is not a Buddhist, but that does not mean the Christian needs to disrespect the Buddhist. We do the things we do because we're trying to say that we are different and what we believe is different. So that does not go to say that the Christians should disrespect Buddhist death rituals or rites. We're simply saying this is what we do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, everyone, for your interesting and factual and helpful perspectives that you shared with us. Because we're living in the New York metropolitan area where we have the advantage of flavors from so many parts of the world, so expanding our recognition of North America to include the Caribbean, English-speaking and Spanish-speaking, and to some extent in my world, French-speaking, Haitians, and so on. There is a different flavor that I would like to add to the room, and that is the social, cultural part from that perspective, where death and the recognition of death and the celebration of the life that passed has a very celebratory nature to it, where we would often have week-long celebrations of death. So often when we return to the Caribbean, as I had to this summer, twice this summer, English-speaking Caribbean, Jamaica in particular, a funeral lasts a whole week because the whole community is involved in the death and the putting away of that person. So there's people will come to the home every day. They'll come for special times the 9th day after the death. And that's not a minimal or casual thing. Everyone in the community, particularly in rural communities, would come out to be with the family. There's recognition for how you prepare the grave site. So there's a whole big thing about digging a grave and decorating the grave and all of that. Because so many English-speaking Caribbeans went to Cuba years ago, and they're still there. There's even a Jamaican and an African flavor to a lot of Afro-Cuban deaths and recognition of death, celebrations of death. And I'm familiar with them, of course. And just wanted to say that death and preparing of the body, preparing of graves, being with the family. A number of people on the panel mentioned the importance of your presence. Presence is so important in Caribbean funeralizing. So people will come from all over the world to be there for a funeral, and the days before a funeral, days after, because presence is so important. So just to bring a slightly different flavor, another flavor to this whole issue of death and dying and celebration. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really important comment. I think that it is one of the things we are that's very positive about the globalization that we're experiencing right now, is that we have an opportunity to see the beautiful rituals and cultures that are not typically for the mainstream culture has been a European-centered culture in the United States. The truth is actually that in, I think, 13 out of the 19 largest cities in the United States, white European Americans are in a minority. So I think it's really time to even stop talking about what mainstream America does and start really looking to the cultures that over many years and perhaps through greater suffering has, has maintained and created cultures around death that are very cathartic, very helpful in the grieving process. So we have a lot to learn, those of us who look like me, European, and I'm kind of from Northern Europe. I'm Swedish, so I'm really, really cold. Thank you.
Yes. I've lost 3 family members in the past year.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And then I lost 3 more mentors in the past year. And my grandparents who are now ailing, they're 87 years old. And for the first time a few days ago, I actually had to give my grandfather his first bath because he was too weak. And out of 4 grandchildren, I'm the middle child, I'm the younger side. And out of the 3, I've asked them to come and help, and they're that type of people to isolate themselves. And of course you have distant family who does not want to help. And I'm like one of the only children in the family, I'm one of the youngest people who actually come out and help the elderly. Now my question being is that my grandparents are 87 years old. I call them I'm their favorite grandchild, even though they don't want to admit it. Anyway, what do you do if suddenly they lost? Because if they suddenly die, I would be devastated. And my father always gives, why are you thinking about that? And the reason why I'm thinking about it is they're 87 years old, and you don't understand. I love my grandparents. I seriously do. And I love all my family. And the reason why I'm stressing this is, let's say they do die. My question to you is, what do I do in that state? Because they don't have power of attorney. They don't have anything like that. And it can be emotionally and physically and mentally draining. And I'm drained out. They came to see us in 3 weeks, and my grandfather got sick, and my grandmother got diagnosed with bronchitis, and my grandfather got diagnosed with walking pneumonia, all in one trip. And I had to take care of 2 people. So what would you do if someone just, unfortunately, the next day, God forbid, they die, but they had no legalities, nothing? Like, is there any way that you can step up and say, hey, or will the state take over and just say, no, screw you, you know? That's what's happened in the past.
It gets, I don't know if anybody else wants to take that, but I can make some comments after you do.
Okay, the first thing I would do if you have no current resources and your parents don't have a will or power of attorney or anything like that, if it does happen, find an estate lawyer. Those are the guys that can navigate you through the process of like the overhead, like legally, financially, what needs to happen. That's what they do. Unfortunately, if there is no will, the process becomes a lot more convoluted. You're going to go through these processes called probate, and you need a lawyer. The state it's easier to have the lawyer interact with the state than having you do it, because it becomes a full-time job if you don't have it set up. So that would be my advice. But what we've been talking about throughout this panel, trying to have initiating that conversation is probably the best preemptive thing you can do to get. I'm not 100% familiar with it, but there are legal documents that you can initiate online.
Yes, absolutely. And I totally agree with you. And my hunch is that your grandparents are very aware that they are 87 years old and that there is a good chance they're not going to be alive 20 years from now, right? So very often we're so scared. I have been, as a hospice volunteer, I have spoken with the older person the person who's dying, who is saying, I can't really have this conversation about my wishes for my funeral because, as if the child didn't know that they were dying, they're on hospice, and, the vice versa, and the child saying, I can't bring this up with it's too sensitive. Generally, if the conversation is opened up, everybody's very comfortable speaking with it once that door is open, because people really, they want to get, your grandparents don't want to leave you stranded. And I think you can say that, to go back to them and say, I just went to this panel, and I realized that there are certain things that I would love if you could do, just do me as a favor. Can we just print this will out online? If they don't have a lot of assets, that's complicated enough. If they have a lot of assets, you might need a lawyer, but then they can probably also afford to pay for a lawyer to do that. And if the same thing with a durable power of attorney. Suppose that you really need to pay their bills, and you don't have a durable power. Durable means that it lasts beyond the time that they have capacity. And that's also printable online. And it's better to have that than to have nothing. And, I don't know if you know what they would want in terms of decision-making. If somebody said, let's hook mom up or grandmother up to to life support, would they want that or not? And often you don't have to ask those difficult questions. If somebody really wants to die at home, a tracheal life support is not an option. You can't do that at home. So if you know that that's their overall goal, so talk about overall goals and wishes with them. But I would definitely encourage, and you might have to try more than once. This is not a 1-minute conversation. But they know that you love them, and tell them that. I mean, I'm really hugely in favor of IR Biox 4 things that we should all say to the person that is dying. Please forgive me. There's always something to be forgiven for. And please, and if there is something that you want to forgive them for, I forgive you, whatever it might have been. And then, thank you. Thank you for the relationship that we have, and I love you. And, even just saying those things to your grandmother, thank you for being here so many years for me, and you know how much I love you. There's one little favor that would really help me, and see if you can get into the conversation that way, because it is a lot easier than probate and trying to figure out the answers for decision-making if they end up on life support.
Yeah. And if you know someone that's a notary, have them come with you, because I think a lot of them need to be notarized. So
actually, your healthcare proxy does not need to be notarized. The other documents will. Your other documents need to be.
So just keep that in mind also, that you can't do it at home and then bring it somewhere and it's legal. That there is a process, and a lot of the online services actually do kind of outline what you need to do.
My father's a notary, so that...
There you go.
You got it.
On the financial aspect, what measures are taken in our country to ensure that there's no stigma associated with the burial of poor people?
Huge topic, particularly in the face of Hart Island, which is where we place people in the New York City area whose bodies are not identified. I don't think it's a financial thing as much as it is a social thing. But you're absolutely correct. We used to say, death is the great equalizer. It is not the great equalizer. People are treated completely differently when they're dying and after death, depending on how important they are socially, financially, culturally. And I think the best thing we can do as a society is to advocate. I really feel very strongly about speaking, trying to change our system. We're talking about how it's difficult to keep somebody home on hospice if you don't have the resources, because towards the end, you're likely to need somebody 24 hours a day. Why do our nursing homes not have a couple of special rooms for people who are dying? Why do they have to be in, double rooms with all the noise going on around them? It's not that expensive. Maybe it's something that can be legislated, and if not, these are things worth fundraising. I am really sorry. The stigma can only be removed by lots of conversations, and I think that's a really, really important thing that you're all starting here today. And don't make it stop today. Keep this conversation going. It's so important for everyone.
When my mother died, before my mother died, she did a very wonderful, beautiful thing. She set up bank accounts for both of my children, which was lovely. I spent years trying to resolve that because the way she set it up, basically, long story short, my husband and I had to go prove that we were the guardians. We needed, the birth certificate. It was a mess. So my question is, nobody could have anticipated that. I think that she planned very well otherwise, but there was that. There were a couple of other little details that took a very long time to work out. So who do you go to? Is there like a one-stop shop of, when I'm doing my planning, what are all of the things I need to know? What are all of the things that I need to do so that I do not pass an unfortunate situation on to someone else?
Do you want to start that?
Yeah. The most important thing is your will. This is after any advance directive stuff. This is after if you happen to pass. The most important document is the will. That's pretty much what everything's going to play off of. When you do your will, again, I advise it to speak within this. If you can, speak with an estate lawyer because they have the experience to say, but what about this? But what about this? But what about this? As far as kind of like a template or anything, I'm not entirely sure. Because everyone's situation is different. There are so many. The thing that when I saw what my parents did to prepare and what when I was doing everything for myself is kind of keep track of everything you log into a month, all your different stuff, write it all down, and that'll inform you on what you need to take care of. My 401k. My bank account, do you have any other retirement assets? Physical assets are kind of the big pain in the butt if you're not properly prepared. And those are the ones you have to put itemized out what you want to do with each specific thing. Also, when we were talking about earlier, there's stuff you can set out with your accounts. It's called direct inheritance. That's something to have a conversation with your banker or your investment guy about, is that if you designate direct inheritance, you can kind of bypass a lot of the probate process, and your children will have access to funds immediately without having to go through like life insurance taking 3 months to come through or other financial safeguards that you put in place. For direct inheritance, I think it's just you setting it up with your banker or your investment people, and I think it needs to be witnessed. Not entirely sure, but for your children to get access to those funds or those safeguards, they just need death certificates. But the will is, just be as thorough as you can with the will, because I'm sure, as you know, the more that's spelled out, the easier the process ends up being. And especially if you're dividing stuff out percentage-wise and stuff, it's much easier to spell things out than to have family. Like, I didn't go through this, but I know some families go through arguing about inheritance, that's no.
No, there is no template. The Westchester Midlife Coalition put together something we call the Be Prepared Kit, which included one page with financials, and we had several focus groups, and we ended up with a document that really ended up somewhere in the middle, because some people have very few assets and all of it is irrelevant, or most of it, and others have such complicated assets that, so speaking to your accountant and speaking to a lawyer, are unfortunately the things that you have to do to get that cleared up. And while we're mentioning it, the death certificate, make sure you get it from the beginning in the original in lots of copies. I know somebody got 30 copies because each bank, each insurance, everybody wants to see the death certificate, and they want it in the original. And you can still get it afterwards in the original, but it's more expensive than if you get it all at the same time. So get lots of those.
And it takes a few months to get it after the first round.
Right, so make sure you do that.
The reason why is they have these raised seals, so they're very specific. So that's one of the things. It's kind of like to write down for something. If you put a book together that has instructions, make sure to request multiple copies of the originals.
So there was just one other question that was submitted prior to our talk for the panel. Why are people so afraid to talk about death?
I'm not, so I have to give that question to somebody else.
I'm not afraid to talk about it. Maybe at one time I was, but I think when you experience death, it changes your outlook a little bit. So my mother died, and it was after that that if people heard the conversations I had with my father, he's 82, they would think we were crazy because we talk about it openly. My whole family does. So I think once you experience a death, I think it's easier then to open yourself up to talk about it with other members of your family. So I think people are afraid of the unknown, and that's why they're afraid to talk about it. They're afraid to lose the person, so that's why they're afraid to talk about it.
Great.
The 90-year-old woman who said, if I die, we all have to use the word when, right? We just hope it's going to be a while.
So I just want to, I think we're going to close at this point. I want to thank the panel for their work, and this is a big topic. We've unpacked quite a bit here today, and there's a lot still to be covered. It's a sobering topic as well, so thank you for your participation in the audience and of course, for the panelists. And I'll turn it
Yes,
over to
thank you
Amy.
very much. And Dr. Stout, this is a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you very